Hello and welcome to the third iteration of the Global Student Dialogue in NYU's Global Network University. Our theme this year is the past, present, and future of social movements on the anniversary of the 1968 summer and social movements during that time. We've had two previous iterations of the Global Student Dialogue. Last year's was on Trump's first 100 days. And the first one was on the Syrian refugee crisis and responses in Europe. We're very happy today to have 5 presenters with us to speak to different facets of social movements. And each speaker will have around 15 to 20 minutes. And we'll take a break after the first panel and come back for the second panel and a final roundtable. I would just like to thank a few people for putting together this dialogue and for sponsoring us. Special thanks go to Ellen Toscano, the Executive Director of NYU Florence, Catherine Robinson, the Director of NYU London, and Julie Mostov, the Dean of Liberal Studies in NYU on the Square. Special thanks especially go to Courtney Hoff here at NYU London, Scott Palmer, and Fenton Green. Scott is in Florence, who is responsible for putting together the technological things on that end, and Fenton Green is responsible in London. I am happy to turn the microphone over to our first presenter, Emily Sheele, who is in NYU Florence.
Sweet. Hello, my name's Emily. I'm a sophomore in Florence. I'm studying econ, but my research comes out of an internship I've done here with La Pietra Dialogues, a research internship. And one of the projects I worked on was studying the student movement in 1968. But really starting in 1960 and kind of moving through present day. So I looked at 14 movements specifically, 7 in the US and 7 in Europe. I looked at legislative victories that came out of those movements. And then from there, we looked at statistics in civic engagement of young people, so students, but also I think sometimes during my research, I found that young people and students were synonymous, but that's not necessarily the case with some of the statistics I looked at. And then I looked at voter registration and voter turnout specifically in the realm of civic engagement. So yeah, I'm gonna share a screen that's mostly for my benefit, but it'll show you a little bit my thought process kind of while I was putting together the presentation. So if you can't see it, that's okay, because I'll kind of verbalize everything. But if you can see it, that's even better. So first I wanna look at I'm just gonna leave it like this. I want to look at the 1968 in the US because I think that's most relevant for me, especially just being a student in the US now and kind of looking at activism. So if we start in the top left corner, we see this first, it's going to be a bit of a timeline, and I'm going to try to move pretty quickly through it. I'm going to start myself a timer so I don't run over. So January 15th, a congresswoman from Montana, Jeanette Rankin, she was a pacifist kind of throughout her entire involvement in politics, but she was the first woman who said no to the war in Vietnam, and she voted against, and I think she was the only no vote in the entire congressional vote at that point, which struck up this first kind of all women movement, and it was a strike, and it was a march on Washington with 5,000 women. And then from there, we can move over here, and it's going to be a little bit out of order just because it's how it happened when I was kind of writing it all down. So then in Cleveland, Ohio, we have this Glenville shootout, which was, it was a protest against racial tension and poverty. Obviously, it was, the 68 was kind of in the midst of the civil rights, maybe you could say towards the end of the height of it, but kind of we're still in civil rights, so that's not really correct to say. And then I have statistics, 3 dead policemen, 3 dead Black militants, 1 dead bystander, and then 5 days of riots after. This is kind of one of those movements that wasn't necessarily just students, it was young people, but it affected the entire community and kind of, it was in the broader scope of the national scheme. So I should point out that a lot of these movements that we saw on campuses they started out as campus movements, but they ended up being kind of tied to political issues that were kind of affecting the entire nation. Something on this page I really want to point out is down here in the right corner, you see a really kind of significant protest happened on our campus in New York. There was a picket of, it was 500 NYU students kind of showed up to this school-sponsored recruiting event for the Dow Chemical Company, which at that point was the largest producer of napalm. So this was kind of an on-campus anti-war kind of demonstration, but obviously, like, you know, I think a lot of people in the community were enraged about it. Then we have this huge movement at the Olympics where we have two track. I think they were being awarded for being for winning the gold and the silver in a track event. And it's, I'm sure you've heard of it. It's that they kind of put their fists up with black gloved fists to kind of in protest of poverty of African Americans, but also violence towards them. And then here's another university movement at South Carolina State. Students were protesting at a bowling alley initially. It was an all-white bowling alley, so they were kind of protesting, you know, segregation. And then it ended up being kind of a huge protest that went back onto the SC State campus, which ended in 5 deaths and 27 injuries. So that all occurred within 1 year, 1968. But then I kind of want to look, I'm going to name a few events or the protests that I looked at that occurred from 1960 actually into present day. So you have the Greensboro sit-ins, which were a part of the civil rights movement, but I think the 4 young men who started the lunch table sit-ins, I think were students. And then obviously this huge label that I put on anti-war movements, and then obviously the student movement of 1968, which we just kind of looked at. And then in present day, we have Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, and then the Parkland student movement. I wanted to say quickly about Parkland. It's really unique because it's not college students. This is kind of not one of, it might be one of the first movements that we see that's just the K through 12 age group, which is kind of significant because it's kids living in their parents' homes still without like the freedom that those of us who are college students enjoy. So then next, let's see if I can move over. We can look at Europe really quickly. Like I said, this slide's just kind of for my own train of thought. I think when we think of the 1968 movement in Europe, we think of Paris at the Sorbonne. But obviously, like everywhere else, there were kind of a lot of other things going on. The university uprisings of 1968 were centralized in Paris, but also a movement in Poland, in Warsaw. So on this paper, if you care to look, there is kind of a timeline of the events that kind of unwinded as a result of the first. So the University of Paris was split across 2 campuses. You have Nanterre and Sorbonne. I think there might have been more, but these movements just occurred at these 2. So it initially started out with students expressing their grievances over not having a co-ed dorm. And then it kind of evolved into this larger issue of, you know, lack of representation. And then it involved, it started to kind of take in young people from all over Paris, and then it ended up being a workers' strike. So what I really like about this event is it kind of shows the nature of student movements, because it starts out with students being kind of disgruntled about things that are going on campus, but then it evolves into students realizing that they can voice their concerns about not only campus issues, but political issues that they're feeling kind of in their city, in their nation, or worldwide, which is kind of what we saw here, because you know, a couple weeks into the University of Paris issues, it ended up being all of Paris kind of took up arms, I guess, because there was a huge workers' strike also. So that is all I wanted to say about that. And then in the 60s in Europe, the other kind of student movements or movements with young people that I looked at were Prague Spring, which was huge, and it wasn't just students. Is a liberalization of Czechoslovakia in 1968 under Alexander Dubček, I think. And then we have the revolutions of 1989. And then after that, which among those are the Velvet Revolution in the Czech, and then the Romanian Revolution, which was also in 1989. And then kind of more modern movements, the UK student protests, which occurred after Parliament announced that they were, I think, tripling student university tuition. So let's move on. Sorry, there's a lot to cover. So then after I looked at these movements kind of specifically, I wanted to look at, I looked at a couple academic papers that talked about kind of the impact or the social impact now of these movements. I'm gonna kind of move the camera back to myself, sorry. I can leave it on there. So the thing that I liked most about reading these papers were just a couple of small quotes that I think were kind of potent as far as explaining why 1968 is still relevant and why student movements have such traction kind of in the political scheme. So I read this paper written by Albert, their last names were Albert and Cohen, and I have it all linked on my research if anyone ends up being interested. But they wrote that the 1968 movements imposed a historical reputation on students moving forward, meaning that the movements in 1968 were kind of, they weren't the first student movements, but I think they gained so much traction because it was globalized. The movements were kind of inspiring each other. So where one movement would gain traction, maybe it would start gaining traction nationally, and then it would gain traction globally. And now I think that what a lot of scholars are arguing is that now that we realize kind of what students are capable of, we have this reputation and maybe this obligation to kind of continue voicing our concerns on campus because it is a legitimate way to kind of make social change. So something that was significant about the 68 movements is they were the first ones that were being documented on television and the first ones that were able to be kind of nationally and then globally broadcasted, which kind of makes a huge difference because, you know, Angela Davis talks about how when she was organizing events, they were doing it by snail mail. So it starts changing when you're able to put it on television and you're able to kind of broadcast it. And I think that's maybe part of the reason why the 68 movements were so relevant. And then the point I already said is that these movements are kind of sustained and that one demonstration kind of inspired another, and that's why it kind of was a global phenomenon, I guess you could say. So before I run out of time, I want to look at these statistics I found. So we started out, the statistics that I was looking at started out being just statistics involved around students pursuing education and then their engagement in activism or just engagement in some sort of civic duty. And I've kind of got some highlights here. So something to note first of all is that in 1968, a fifth of the world's population is between ages 15 to 25. So young people are this huge kind of fraction of the world population, and maybe that's why these movements were so significant. And then we have this study here, young adults who engaged in voting, activism, or volunteering in their communities or generally go further in school or have higher incomes. And that's relevant now, I guess, more so than in the past. And so these statistics here on this page are more recent studies within the last 20 years. So 73% of undergrads today believe an individual can produce societal change. 1 in 10 students entering college expect to participate in protests while they're pursuing their undergrad. And then this study in Britain, so state spending on universities now I think is much, much higher, whereas we go to a private university, so I guess it's a little less relevant. I thought that was really interesting because starting in the 1920s, no more than £1 million, and then in the 60s, 200 million pounds on state spending annually, which kind of goes to show that as more students were kind of pursuing their education in the 60s, I think that's probably why these movements also became so relevant because so many more students were enrolled. In Germany, the enrollment in post-secondary schools grew by 500%, so it's like no wonder. So this last slide, I want to look at statistics related to voter participation and registration of young people. Also, so less so students, but people within the age that a college student would be in. So in the US, I have kind of number statistics and then kind of like generalized statements. So let me pull it up for myself so I can see a little bit better. So So I think that what we realize in the US is that we're kind of fighting at this point voter apathy in young people. Because with everything I've just said, it would be a logical conclusion to say that young people are voting and young people believe that their vote kind of has traction. And that's just not the case in nowhere that I studied, so US and Europe. Young people aren't voting, students aren't voting. And I think that this logic is kind of summed up right down here in the bottom right. Young voters are keen to note participation related to having a say. They're voting because they feel like they have a say, which might be part of the reason they're not voting, because they feel like they're making some statement by not voting that they, don't trust the government, or they don't condone the actions of the government. Whereas generations older than us are voting because they feel like they have the civic duty to do so. They feel like I think that older generations remember a time maybe they all couldn't vote, or a time when they realized that their votes did have a say, whereas young people, I think, don't really have this like reverence for the right to vote, or a reverence for the right to kind of engage in this civic duty. So then in Britain, I found this really, there was a really interesting study published that says young people are reported to be most likely to talk to their friends and family about political issues, but the least likely of all to vote. Okay, so these countries down here in bold, that I've kind of written out largely, in all of these countries, ages 18 to 24 have the lowest voter turnout. Okay, Italy is one of the few. It's the only country that I studied that young people are voting more than some age group. Okay, so I think that's really interesting because when you're doing, or I guess I can speak for myself here. When I was studying all these movements, I really thought, wow, young people are so politically engaged and so politically inclined to kind of share how they're feeling by doing some sort of civic engagement. So I just assume that we're voting, here we are at NYU and all of our friends, I'm sure, are voting, we're registered. So why aren't young people voting? And I think I didn't find a lot of conclusive reasons why, and there's still some sort of discrepancy behind why we're so vocal to our friends and to our family in person and on social media, and kind of we seem so inclined to talk about politics, yet we are not showing up to the polls. And I think that's really interesting, and I think that that's something to kind of consider. I think that's kind of the takeaway from my research, is kind of looking at how I think that we've seen now, after looking at all these movements, that young people kind of do have traction politically, and we can make some sort of change, but we're not. I think that's kind of all I have. Let me see if I can switch the screen back to myself. Where am I? Sorry. Perfect.
Okay, thank you. Let's turn now to.
Mine's already muted.
Want to mute your microphones there for a sec. We will now turn to Raj Kittusamy, who's presenting on the religious right, a different definition of progress.
I'm just gonna suppress this.
All right. I'm Raj. I'll be presenting basically on white conservatives, namely evangelicals, tend to stick with Trump even after it's been a figure in modern politics. So to begin, the answer extends back some 150 years and involves cultural and political shifts that long predate Donald Trump. It's the story of a culturally confident religious movement became a marginalized and anxious minority seeking political protection behind a figure such as Trump. So first and foremost, I believe it's important to note that in attempting to understand an opposing point of view, historical context specifically is what lies at the core of most popular opinions. the resulting sentiment cannot be accounted for any less. Although white Americans are the majority in terms of demographics and beliefs manifest in inclusive society, to them seems to mean that giving everyone a say leads to them having their say severely minimalized, instead of considered in equal parts. This ironic fear becomes less ironic considering evangelicals feel that other demographics that make up the US do not share their fundamental values. Their perception is less of a steady approach towards an egalitarian society and more of a steady encroaching on their way of life. Therefore, some ought to be seen as reactionary in their core beliefs, but how they feel. So in order to provide the most comprehensive analysis and conclusion I can, we must begin by examining the chronology of evangelicalism, beginning just before the Civil War. And for this historical analysis, I referenced an article by The Atlantic. How do I exit full screen? And this attributed in the April 2018 issue of The Atlantic entitled The Last Temptation, written by Michael Gerson. So in the years before the Civil War, a connection between moralism and a concern for social justice was generally assumed amongst most Northern evangelicals. They variously militated for a variety of different humanitarian issues, mainly for the end of slavery. Now, Southern evangelicals, of course, wouldn't reflect this activism and movements within their own community. However, a key similarity is that their religious beliefs is what motivated their activities. It's to be expected that any movement or people, while their core beliefs retain some constancy, the expression of those beliefs can change over time, depending on a number of factors, but mainly external and environmental conditions. So social activism was a defining feature of the original evangelical tradition, having believed that the final millennium of human history would be a time of peace for the world and an expansion of the Christian church, culminating in the second coming of Christ. Now, this motivation was known as postmillennialism, but self-direction into public service as a sort of means to progress towards the second coming was destroyed by the coming of the Civil War and the exodus from Europe that followed. The Civil War itself destroyed most of these optimistic trends in social and inclusive activism expressed and observed by Northern evangelicals, as their sort of morale basically plummets as a result of the consequences of the Civil War. We observe from Southern evangelicals that sort of like an association between the loosened traditional social bonds of urbanization and Jews from the old world. So here I believe that it's important to note that both progressives and evangelicals have to take responsibility towards contributing to the contemporary psyche of evangelicalism. In this case, it's evangelicalism standing in the way of social inclusivity. Perceiving the mass migration as a cause for the break from traditional social norms, they've associated basically correlation with causation. This general pessimism about the direction of society was reflected in a shift away from postmillennialism towards premillennialism. In this view, the current age is tending not toward progress, but rather toward decadence and chaos. So precursors to these feelings of encroachment have set in, and it would only go on to intensify. The preceding attacks on the evangelical community stem from the emergence and surrounding features of the evolution debate. The ridicule evangelicals faced attempting to reject evolution culminate in a turning point in history. Specifically, it is the account of journalist and critic H.L. Mencken on his sort of dismissal and tearing into of William Jennings Bryan after the Scopes Monkey trial, calling him a tin pot pope, that had fundamentalists sort of turning into these comic figures subject to world-class condescension. It's this historical accountability for the evolution debate, in this case, lies with progressives. Belittling discursive methods on this topic ultimately played its part in driving evangelicalism into an isolated subculture. Religious conservatives, as a result, embraced fundamentalism to root themselves in traditional religious views, but it did not propose other evangelicalism. The evangelicalism that we saw before the Civil War, it responded to modernity in ways that went past. Trends in evangelical sentiment don't always reflect the Christian values reflected by Northern evangelicals, because those values, as we see, may simply just be a reactionary entity to progressive modernism. Feelings of premillennialism, therefore, persist quite consistently in the 20s and 30s into the modern era. With that context in place, we arrive in the late 60s. Where key players associated with the movement evangelical population into political engagement. So for my research into the late 60s into the 2000s and the evangelical process, I referenced an Al Jazeera historical research report in partnership with American historians. So we'll start with Paul Wyrick, an evangelical political activist and commentator, credited with the calculated effort that turned the religious right into a political force. When Wyrick first arrived in DC in the late 60s, he was more conservative than most liberal-leaning Republicans. Religion and politics was still largely separate, and evangelicalism was still in retreat after the Scopes monkey trial. So he had to start this movement basically with an uphill climb and as a minority within his own party. He would have to start by attracting other key players that would help him galvanize the movement. He began with school segregation as his issue in the 15 years after the Brown v. Board of Education decision. Public schools in 7 states, especially Missouri, were basically still racially segregated. These states hid behind their freedom of choice system, Black families from public schools. Some white communities were actually so against integration, different neighborhoods, and created private schools where basically only white students were allowed to attend. These were basically church-sponsored segregation academies, as most historians like to put it. So a court ruling out of Holmes County, Mississippi in 1960 granted American families a decisive victory by rejecting private schools' tax. President Nixon went on to direct the IRS to enforce new policy on denying tax exemptions to segregated schools, even if there was a church sponsorship. So this is how Paul Wyrick gets the attention of Jerry Falwell, since Falwell had his own segregation academy in Lynchburg, Virginia. Together at last, Wyrick and Falwell began their crusade by first shifting the grounds of the debate from basically providing a justification for the tax-exempt status by making it about government interference into their religious freedoms. So more and more academies start to lose their tax-exempt status. So Wyrick's repositioning was attracting the support of more and more evangelical leaders. But he needed something to motivate grassroots evangelicals. And this is where the abortion issue comes into play. So Roe v. Wade was made in 1973. And 5 years later, in the 78 midterm elections, Wyrick's pro-lifers flooded church parking lots to build up that grassroots platform. As a result, the 4 Democratic nominees favored to win in Minnesota and Iowa lost to 4 pro-life Republicans. At the same time, Phyllis Schlafly, a constitutional lawyer and political activist, rallied women around her staunchly conservative social and political views. An anti-feminist who opposed legal abortion, her campaign worked in stopping the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. At the 1977 National Women's Conference in Houston, the anti-feminists, led by Phyllis, organized a highly successful counterconference. And this is where they announced the beginning of a pro-family movement to fight against politicians who had been supporting feminism and liberalism and to promote family values in American politics. By 1979, Jerry Falwell had the momentum he needed to organize the moral majority, declaring war on the pervasiveness of progressive values. The group then enlisted the help of Francis A. Schaeffer. Schaeffer produced a series of films entitled Whatever Happened to the Human Race and had them screened across the country for evangelical audiences. Here's a small quote from one of these films. "The fact that human life is being devaluated is demonstrated by some of the major issues which are being debated by society today: abortion, infanticide, euthanasia." And so by the 1980 presidential election, grassroots evangelicals had the motivation Wyrick needed. As a result of these leaders' strategies and many others, the evangelical political agenda has been narrowed by its nature. Rather than choosing their own agendas, evangelicals have been pulled into a series of social and political debates started by others. So turning our strategies in mind to the recent presidential election, we can see how Steve Bannon and Donald Trump have been inspired by the late 60s and 70s. So to now sort of draw a conclusion using a comparative analysis on white working class Americans, I'll be referencing 2 studies and a second Atlantic article entitled "People Voted for Trump Because They Were Anxious, Not Poor" by Olga Kazan. And this takes more of a psychological approach at observing these trends. So instead, Olga writes, it was about dominant groups that felt threatened by change and a candidate who took advantage of that trend. So key terms in political discourse carry different connotations depending on the person's background. What I mean is, for liberals, progressivism might mean logical and just and righteous. For evangelicals, this connotation tends to proceed along the lines of morally corrupt. So we have to make clear the importance of semantics, and that debates need to be prefaced first with standard definitions that prevent illogical fallacies and insecurity. This could be why, in one of the studies I looked at, whites who were presented with evidence of racial progress actually experienced lower self-esteem afterward. In the second study, reminding whites who were high in ethnic identification that non-white groups will soon outnumber them revved up their support for Trump, their desire for anti-immigrant policies, and their opposition to political correctness. So for the first time since Europeans arrived in this country, white Americans are being told that they will soon be a minority race. So through the observance of white working class sentiments, it's evident more than ever that white conservatives adhere to Trump and subscribe to a rigid maintenance of the status quo, not because of their beliefs, but because of these fears and the root causes of these fears. The fluid transformation of the Christian mission since before the Civil War, despite Christian values remaining largely unchanged, proves that belief constancy is not what should be questioned, but how they're expressed through reactionary methods. Meanwhile, a few things did correlate with support for Trump: a voter's desire for their group to be dominant. This unfounded sense of persecution is far from rare, however, and it seems to be heightened during moments of societal change. We observed this during Reconstruction and Lincoln's election, as well as right now. In another Atlantic article, a contributor, Emma Green, writes that white evangelicals see more discrimination against Christians than Muslims in the United States. And 79% of white working class voters who had anxieties about the American way of life chose Trump over Clinton. Furthermore, in the fall of 2016, several surveys showed many men supported Trump because they felt their status in society was being threatened and that Trump would be the answer to restoring it. They dispel the fiction that the majority of Trump supporters are disenfranchised victims of capitalism's cruelties. At the same time, deep-seated psychological upset is hard to address in policy. So at this point, it's pretty clear that many Trump supporters feel threatened, frustrated, and marginalized, unfounded or not on an economic or social level, but on an existential level. Further research I plan on conducting into this topic, creating dialogue across the aisle in order to create a more inclusive sense of progressivism. The Democratic Party will adopt in elections and times. That's it for me. I'll go ahead and...
Okay, thank you, Raj. Now are turning to Rachel Levy, who will speak about the right to die, how we stand up for the students of 1968.
Hi, I am going to set up my PowerPoint quickly.
Did you share with me?
Yeah, it's an email.
Okay.
Sorry, your email is
RPK 295.
Sorry, just one moment.
This one? Oh, okay. Saving to try. So,
Sorry. Do you want to DJ?
Yeah, sure.
Hi, my name is Rachel Levy, and I'm a lifelong advocate of issues of patient rights. I'm honored to join the Global Student Dialogues today to advocate physician-assisted death for the terminally ill, mentally competent patients across the globe. As a public health and applied psychology student, I'm deeply empathetic to issues that relate to maintaining a good quality of life, and I've worked with the Washington State Death with Dignity campaign, the New York Compassion and Choices campaign, and today I'm working in London with the Compassion in Dying organization. I wanted to take my time today to explain how the right to die is enacted across the globe and how these movements are currently affecting the student activists of 1968. The student activists of 68 forced an iconic shift in the way that the general public perceives the emotional state and rights of a student. As many of these activists were in their early 20s at the time, that means that on this 50th anniversary, they're now at least 70 years old. And just as at any stage of life comes with its own associated health worries, many, including the now elderly activists, are tasked with sustaining an acceptable quality of life while prolonging it for as long as possible. This is a complicated task since nearly 65% of the top causes of death in the US are due to diseases that often involve a lot of pain and immobility. For US citizens over 65, the census accounts only 4% of deaths as accidental injury. In the UK, excluding dementia and Alzheimer's, people 65 and older most often suffer from heart and circulatory diseases, respiratory diseases, and lung cancer. These are ugly truths that seem to escape the average human population. But understanding our health better prepare and better empathize with the 68 student activists. We are at a unique point in time where we're scientifically developed to a point of diagnosis, but not advanced enough to cure these terrifying diseases. Many patients today stop their treatments or stop their treatment pills and let their disease take their lives.
Perhaps the more emotionally aggressive is when patients stop their food and drink consumption as well to advance the dying process. When patients are diagnosed and given an arbitrary quantity of time before their disease takes them, there are few options left. As you've likely heard, the most common option is hospice care, where a patient is given numbing drugs and can simply, as one hospice volunteer puts it, wait out their disease in a peaceful way. However, medication can only sustain to a certain point, and this option involves a brutal level of patient suffering and a painful experience for the family and friends to witness. With the birth of this right to die movement and the turn of the century, we're creating options for mentally competent terminally ill patients to control their end-of-life care. As of 2017, only 5 states have legislated physician-assisted death. That's Colorado, California, Oregon, Vermont, Washington, and Washington, D.C. In these states, there's a clear process for using physician-assisted death in a timely and appropriate manner. In addition, Montana has mandated that it is not illegal for patients to assist in death, although the specific process of physician-assisted death is not outlined. In Florida, a physician who's involved in physician-assisted death would be prosecuted for manslaughter. There is a growing attention for the campaign for Dignity in Dying in the UK-based Dignity in Dying campaign, with local hubs in Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool, and even in Edinburgh. The issue up for discussion most recently is the conscientious objection right of a healthcare professional to refuse to administer these types of services. Similarly, like choice-based movements, I would speculate that this issue could one day be covered by an international governing body, such as the United Nations, which could help ensure that people who are mentally healthy, but physically suffering are not forced to continue living. The UK is currently attempting to mirror the system for supervising the right to die, as it is used in the US. The requirements to use the law are relatively similar across the US. In all cases, the suffering patient must express intent, be diagnosed with terminal illness, be a resident of that state for longer than 6 months with taxes paid. In California, the patient must also be registered to vote and have a driver's license to ensure that only capable, informed residents are using the law. The most important point of the law is that it must be voluntary. This is determined by the patient's ability to speak, being able to self-administer the oral medication. Finally, documentation must be submitted and signed by representatives of the patient in understanding that the death is his objective choice without external influence or persuasion. These representatives can be family members that can attest to the mental security of the patient in his decision. From the time the prescription is issued by the chemist, the medicine is strictly traced, ensuring that it has been enacted only for its intent. This process, like any issue in activism, was what was agreed upon universally. In Washington State, this involves a first oral request from the patient to the doctor, followed by 2 physicians validating that the patient has a terminal illness and will otherwise be dead within 6 months. Following that is the second oral request from the patient, a final written request where 2 additional witnesses need to sign and 1 witness cannot be related to the patient, and 48 hours before the physicians can prescribe, there must be another affirmation of the willingness to use the right to die. And this process, just like any issue in activism, is what is agreed upon universally again. After it has been passed, many find that the 2-week waiting period is too long, while others think that the suffering patients should not be given any control. At this point, there are several groups that are aggressively opposed to this issue, but in the same spirit as the student activists of 68, there are several communities that advocate for patient rights. Firstly, affected by the right, or lack thereof, to die, is the families that watch their loved ones suffer. This has proven to be the primary reasons that individuals become an advocate for this issue, as the emotional stress of seeing someone suffering can tax both the patient and their loved ones. Secondly, liberal groups that are similarly empathetic to pro-choice issues such as abortion and other human rights are proponents by association. Finally, NGOs and charities group all these people together to organize and write policy that can help change law in a formal manner. The goal of this law is to make government a proponent of the right to die by proving that it's the best option for people who are suffering from terminal diseases. The US is uniquely at the forefront of this international liberal issue, perhaps because of the protests of 68, Because the Protest of '68 did not directly relate to our student population, the legalization of the right to die is a natural progression in human rights that is critical to develop in a systematized, sensitive way. Dignitas, an organization based in Zurich, Switzerland, has gained a lot of attention as a European base for this issue, as Dignitas accepts foreign nationals to use their service. In the Benelux countries of Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, various forms of euthanasia are legal. Since 2006 in Belgium, patients can use the law, but first must have a long-term history with their physician and be verified to be ill by 2 doctors. In 2015, the law was expanded to include children, should they have a terminal illness and are deemed to understand the implications of it. The law is nearly identical in the Netherlands, and it was passed in 2001. Lastly, Luxembourg legalized the right to die in 2009. Internationally, the opponents of this issue are all on the same page. In the US, this involves primarily religious groups. Nearly 60% of New York State population is Catholic, and this group is particularly vocal about the pro-life debates that deny any patient choice. Similarly, the US has various disability in the rights groups who are primarily concerned with the law that the right to die will provide a platform for others to take advantage of life insurance payout without patient consent. This is incorrect, and as we have discussed, the laborious process that it takes to legally choose to die, and this is completely impossible without patient consent. In the UK, the groups that, sorry, one second. In the UK, the groups that contest the bill proposal include both disability and religious groups, but also deal with groups that find the proposed law too conservative, and many believe that the restrictions are too strict and that the law should not be even passed without these unnecessary safeguards. These statistics are nearly 20 years old, from 1997 in Oregon, and prove that patients would rather have the option to end their suffering rather than feel forced into letting their terminal disease progress. Options involving starvation and palliative sedation are aggressive and unnecessary when the government acts as a support to these patients. You can see how the orange bars are the amounts of prescriptions that were approved, and the blue is the amount of prescription that were actually used. Within those approved that choose to end the life-ending drug, nearly 90% of those that choose to die, nearly 90% of these people choose to die in their own homes, citing loss of autonomy, decreasing ability to participate in the activities that made life enjoyable, and loss of dignity. However, in 2016, only about half of these patients who were approved for the prescription actually used it. Today, you can continue the activist attitude of '68 by donating to your local charity that works on the issue by volunteering for these local groups. And what's more is that you can contribute to a cause that can help protect the rights of the student aid activists themselves. If you could have benefited from this law, make your concern known by telling your story. And finally, protect yourself by learning about your own rights in your country, state, or city, and by making your wishes known and clear. If we truly are in the second wave of enthusiastic activism, we must stick out for the rights of the aggressively ill who are not going to be given the mobility to fight for their own protections. I would like to conclude by saying that many issues in healthcare are polarized. This invites people to aggressively pin personalities and philosophies to either side of the issue. But as it's not binary, I ask that you view this as a balancing act between the patient's rights and the government's control. There are diverse backgrounds, ethnicities, religions, and perspectives that represent those in support of the right to die, just as there were in the 1968 revolutions that many students across the globe felt. In '68, the issues were primarily to those that affected students, which is a profession that many embraced during their lifetime. But even if an individual chooses not to become a part of the student population, issues in aging inevitably affect us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you to the entire panel. Emily provided us with a nice historical background and articulation of some of the concerns and motivations of the '68 movement. And Raj provided a nice foil or counter to the achievements of '68 in the formation of the religious rights, reaction to that, and their organization and mobilization of their own concerns. Rachel did a nice job of bringing us up to the present in terms of perhaps a new issue for 68ers. Raj mentioned that Trump voters mostly felt an existential threat as a motivation for voting for Trump. And of course, the issue of euthanasia and the right to die internalizes a kind of existential moment for those who we are commemorating in terms of our 50th anniversary of 1968. Thank you very much. We will be taking a short, great, wonderful. Thanks very much. We now return for our second panel today on the future. We have, to start us off, Robert Boley, NYU London. The shelter doesn't take black dogs, the struggle for mental health advocacy in the 21st century.
Yeah, you're good.
Good. Awesome. Okay. So I'm Robert. I'm currently studying in GLS and psychology at NYU London. So kind of just to make an introduction before I go into the presentation. Since this is about the spirit of '68 and movements in the world, I think we should have more of a global focus too, especially since we are NYU students. So a lot of the statistics I will give will be based around the United Kingdom, the United States, but also around the world, because mental health care is not just an issue in the developed world, but also the developing world. So I'm gonna give a lot of statistics. I'm also gonna give a lot of anecdotes because, to quote an NYU professor who wrote the famous article, the philosophical piece, it has a lot of resonance when it comes to mental health care, because not everyone's experience is one and the same with mental disorders and mental illnesses. So having personal experience, personal stories told by other people is critical for the world. The United Nations actually just released in 2016 that depression is the leading cause of disability in the world, including physical disabilities and mental. In conjunction, psychologists around the world are now all coming to agreement, just as scientists do about climate change, that there is a rising prevalence of mental illnesses, and they are getting worse. And going back to people who are affected, people in '68, as the two largest demographics for those who have mental illnesses are those above the age of 60 and from 18 to 26. So the young people who are working these movements today, and we expect to be our future for later, are one of the biggest victims of mental illnesses, including even our prior pioneers in '68. So with that in mind, I think it's time we go straight into the history of mental health care. We've gone a long way, but I would still say a long way to go. Back 7,000 years ago, they had a process called trephination, where if someone was mentally ill, they say, I have a headache, I'm hearing voices, etc. Well, they would just saw a little piece of your brain out, and they'd say, problem solved. Obviously a bit barbaric, or not probably most medically professional. But of course, there was some very good evolution for mental health care, because then they started putting people on stakes and burning them alive because they were possessed by Satan. If that didn't work, there was also bloodletting, a process where you need to get out the bad spirits from your blood or any bad blood in you that's causing these illnesses. And this is basically how mental health care was treated all the way until the 18th century. 18th century is what I would like to call the Victorian legacy, because once they moved away from more of these so-called medieval practices, and we were starting to see the Enlightenment era with more scientific progress, and now we're going from the pre-scientific to the post-scientific, they decided the newest way to deal with mental illnesses would be asylums. And the asylums of this Victorian legacy are probably one of the biggest reasons why mental illnesses became more prevalent as we've got closer to the age of industrialization, and even all the way now. It all roots back to this Victorian legacy. So this was an article posted by The Guardian of just an interview with a survivor from an asylum from the late 60s, who described a couple of quotes which I think are very evident of the quality asylums were. The author described it as the inmate population rather than patients. There was one patient who had been born on the Oak Ward, which was one of the names of the wards at the asylum, 6 years before, and had never left. There appeared to be nothing wrong with him aside from chronic institutionalization. So essentially, just because he was already there in the beginning, they kept him there for 60 years. Finally, sedation was routine, and Meg, the person who gave the story, was regularly strapped to her bed at night. She remembers being haunted by the screaming coming from the locked wards. Now, this is just one of thousands of developed world in order to treat mental illness. The pictured one is one that was in the United Kingdom, which is where the Guardian article got this information from, and got the story from Meg, who that was not her real name, but decided to be anonymous. Now, the problem with asylums, when we go back to the history of mental health care, is they were not stopped until the 1900s, and they started in the 1700s. So after the age of asylums, it kind of turned to a dichotomy of either you're going to the asylum or you're going to go do these other methods. So here's a choice people had if they were mentally ill. Stay in isolation in asylum, well, your disorder will probably get worse, where you will not see many people besides staff, and you're basically put in as you are. Then in the 50s and 60s, there were more developments made, such as lobotomies and metrazole. Where metrazole was where they would give you a pill to induce a seizure, to put you into a coma for about 4 to 10 hours, and there's about 10% mortality rate. So people are obviously feeling very confident, especially when after coming out of these comas, a lot of psychiatrists found that the comas did not destroy the neurons necessary to remove these mental illnesses. Then lobotomies were like, well, if we can't use a coma to do it, we'll literally just cut into the brain, try to cut pieces of the brain out. So these were the kind of treatments we saw only in the past 100 years. I mean, lobotomies were still popular a decade before we saw the Spirit of the 68 movement. And this is the most popular choice for people who had mental disorders. Then, of course, anyone who talks about psychology has to give some recognition to Freud and psychoanalysis for his methods of a more different approach to dealing with mental health care. And although psychoanalysis is not popular today, works by Freud and later doctors in the 70s who had developed new therapy methods such as cognitive behavioral therapy, a very common method you'll see when you go into any psychologist today, or interpersonal therapy. Some even do psychoanalysis, but the point is that thinking outside the box of what the typical psychology standard was of how to treat people is evolving. And we saw this at the beginning of the early 1890s, and it kept going through. Obviously, there were poor involvements like the metrazole or lobotomies, but it's brought us to where we are today, and now we're seeing improved therapy methods such as CBT and IPT. Now that we're moving to the modern history of mental health care, this is where we really see the first movements that are advocating for better mental health care quality arise. So after World War II, we were seeing people were beginning to protest law and state hospitals. Thanks to psychiatric work by Goffman and Wien and Brown, who in the 1950s all the way to 1975, they wrote papers showing that mental illnesses would actually worsen, especially depression, because of these asylums. A law and state hospital, in these words, really is just an asylum. Then in 1966, Wolfenberger was one of the first people to make a citizen advocacy organization in the United States that advocated for the removal or the development of asylums and law and state hospitals and to more of community care centers, which would be more like the hospitals we see today if you have a broken bone. You'll be able to interact with patients, nurses, group therapy, etc. But it wasn't until 1966 where people were starting to advocate for this, because again, 1966 is when a lobotomy was still popular. And then 1979, in the United Kingdom, that's when their first citizen advocacy organization began to move from this law and state hospital to this community care approach. And this is what psychologists call deinstitutionalization. So with deinstitutionalization, it's the movement from going from the asylum isolated approach to a community care center where people have more social interaction, which is one of the core tenets of treating someone who has a mental disorder. Then we saw more research development thanks to these movements in the 70s and 80s, which led to CBT and IPT therapy, enhanced SSRIs, which are essentially drugs mainly treated for depression. They're called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And essentially they stop the serotonin molecule that typically leads to sadness. And when someone has depression on a genetic level, it's amplified, the serotonin. Finally, we hit 2015, we have the CARE Act in the United Kingdom, which is now forcing the NHS, or the National Health Service here in the United Kingdom, to have better care quality standards, have more well-funded psychiatric hospitals, and to give more attention and health insurance benefits to those who are facing mental health issues. Because although there's a lot of advocacy groups in the United Kingdom and in the United States, and I'd say most of the developed world, there's been a clear split between whether it was a general practitioner issue, like a physical ailment, or a mental one. And your healthcare insurance didn't cover both. It just covered physical, which meant it got pretty expensive for people in treatment. And this segues exactly into the obstacles that we see for treatment today, which these are some of the reasons why we need to have a more reinvigorated movement for mental health issues. So first is institutionalization, as I was saying. There are very few, but there are asylums that are still existing today, especially in the United Kingdom and the United States. And more importantly, a lot of these psychiatric hospitals that are supposed to be community care oriented are now becoming more institutionalized, and we're seeing more isolation and other effects. And I'm going to give one example of a local hospital here in the UK in a little bit, where we're starting to see more of an asylum rather than a community care approach. Next, we have the issue of misdiagnosing, overdiagnosing. So recently, the American Psychology Association reported the newest edition of the DSM-5 from the DSM-4, which is a manual used to diagnose people with mental health disorders. Now, the problem with the DSM-5 the psychology community has, in comparison to the DSM-4, is it's a lot more broad. And because it's so broad, it makes it easier for people to misdiagnose, as in someone could have schizophrenia when they really don't, or they could say they have psychosis, which is delusions, hallucinations, when really someone could just been having heat stroke one day. Or if it's not a misdiagnosis or an overdiagnosing, it's a misdiagnosing. So people that have severe depression could walk into a psychologist, they're using the DSM-5, but because their symptoms of depression don't match what the DSM-5 classify as symptoms of depression, they won't be treated. Because if you're not diagnosed, you can't be prescribed medicine like SSRIs that are necessary and the best treatment we have today for combating depression. Then there's also just the issue of access to treatment. Those in a test comparing the effectiveness of SSRIs, which again, a very common antidepressant like Lexapro, versus placebos. And they found that 82% of the placebos were effective. Now the results could mean two things. One, that the first thing someone could think of is like, wow, these people must not really have a mental disorder if the placebos were effective. But that wasn't really the case. The case was that big pharmaceutical companies that were making these SSRI pills, importantly, go prevent and inhibit the serotonin uptake. So basically, they were giving people sugar pills. It wasn't because people thought they were not actually mentally ill. On the other hand, it was just because big pharmaceutical companies were pumping out more pills with fewer medicines in them and fewer chemicals to make more money. And that's one of the biggest issues that the movement sees today is big pharma, because they're gaining more profit. They realize that when the World Health Organization and the United Nations have been reporting that mental illnesses are rising across the world, that means the demand's going up. They're going to be making more pills, and they can care less about the quality of the pills as long as they're taking them out or producing them. And even then, as we've seen with other cases like recent contemporary events, a lot of pharmaceutical companies are drastically and unfairly raising prices, which means a lot of people, they can be diagnosed and they literally cannot afford their medication. This is not also just an issue of big pharmaceutical companies, but also the government for not providing better healthcare treatment and policies that cover both physical and mental illnesses, like I said, is a big issue with our current healthcare system in at least the developed world. Then we have the issue of stigma, which is one of the biggest issues which movements today are trying to tackle, because that's what a lot of the social movements' main objective is removing stigma. People will be too afraid to report they have a mental illness because they think they won't get a job, etc. But that's why there was the 2015 CARE Act and the Disabilities Act in the United States that both protect people who have mental disabilities. You can't be discriminated against to be employed. However, a lot of companies have been finding loopholes around this, and a lot of companies are trying to make mental health treatment programs for the workers, which end up, if the workers don't comply with the treatment or they're not successful, they'll be fired. So clearly companies like Big Pharma and other small companies are finding loopholes in order to kick these people out for having mental disorders. So clearly, if the stigmas prevent you from getting a job, you're not gonna wanna go seek treatment, whether it be medication or therapy. And this also has a lot of conservative thinking from for myself, I come from the Bible Belt area, and a lot of that is you gotta pray the illness away. So a lot of these kind of discussions that you hear in the South, particularly, is what prevents people from seeking treatment, because they think, it's a spiritual solution, not a biomedical issue or psychological issue. Then there's finally poor quality treatment. And this leads me to an anecdote that I can speak up from personal experience. So earlier in the semester, I was hospitalized and put in Nightingale Psychiatric Hospital in London. And thankfully for me, Nightingale is one of the highest rated, it's one of the most well-respected private hospitals in London. Again, though, it's a private hospital. When I came out, despite what insurance covered, there were higher rates charged to me because of having to go to a private hospital, which of course, these increased rates are exactly why other people who aren't as wealthy cannot go and receive the necessary treatment because it's too expensive. But I'd always hear horror stories while I was at the Nightingale of a place called the Priory. And the Priory is a psychiatric hospital in London. It's NHS based, so it's a government sponsored hospital. And people told me, if you want to know what the Priory is like, look at the Google reviews, because it has about 2 stars right now on Google reviews. But if you think about the people who are giving these Google reviews, it's people who were patients, other nurses. And I looked further into these horror stories I heard of the Priory to see what the stats were. And there was a BBC article titled, "The Priory Hospital Ordered to Improve After Inadequate Rating." The Priory Hospital was understaffed in core areas necessary for treating mental health development, such as child-adolescent development and eating disorders, which eating disorders, besides depression, lead to the highest rates of suicide. And the reason why youth target is so important and why lacking staff for that department at the Priory is really dangerous for mental health care and treatment global is because you mentioned earlier are the highest demographic likely to suffer from a mental disorder. Not only that, the second leading cause of death, at least in the United States, for those who are in the youth demographic who have a mental illness, is that suicide's the second leading cause. So when the Priory is not giving the necessary staffing, because one, it could be the staff don't care and they have poor treatment, but more of the time it's because the hospitals aren't paying the staff enough to care, have to fill these vacant spots. And when youth specifically are not targeted, it's only worsening the issues. And as you can see on the statistic on the slide, that they found a report that between 2011 and 2017, there were 271 suicides directly attributed to NHS failures in treatment. So this just goes to show why the movement is so necessary now, because there's not been enough hard-hitting mental health care policy, at least in the United Kingdom, and it can speak for the rest of the world as well, that are not giving enough attention to the most important areas of what are very easily preventable deaths. But that's not the case that we're seeing today. But I don't want to talk about just states, because it's important that we look at this from a globalized perspective, because a lot of the time, more people abroad in developing nations suffer from mental illnesses than those in the developed world. So this statistic I pulled from the World Health Organization in 2016 report. The statistic said, if you look at the graphs on the left, this is just for developed nations. Now in developed nations, the lowest range is that if you look at the light blue, this is for people who are not receiving treatment. It's about 35% of people in the developed world. Now, if you look at the high end of the range, the second bar graph, it's more close to 50. So this means half the people who are in the developed world are not receiving treatment for reasons of either because of stigma, there's no access, etc. Mentions points I referred to earlier. But what's really fascinating is if you look at the two graphs to the right of the developing world, look at just the lowest range. 75% of people in the developing world are not receiving treatment. And then if you look at the highest range, it's more close to 85. Only 15% of people are receiving the treatment necessary to deal with these mental health disorders that are impacting them. So clearly we can see there is a significant difference between treatment in the developed world and the developing world. And mental health care, we should not look at this through a lens of a westernized approach or a northern approach, but a global holistic one. Because regardless of your ethnicity, your race, your gender, mental disorders can affect at different rates for these demographics, and it can be worse. And more importantly, if you look at this holistically, it affects the whole world. So it's an issue that we all have to deal with. Now, what do all these obstacles mean for people who actually have mental disorders? Well, first, there's the worsening socioeconomic situation. And this was a popular psychologist named social causation hypothesis. What social causation hypothesis found is that people who had mental illnesses, specifically schizophrenia in the case, were more likely to have a worsening socioeconomic situation. And this is because, like I said, people find loopholes around to discriminate against job work, or if they're not being discriminated against, people can't even go up and get jobs. And what does this cost to the economy? I hate to put a dollar sign on human life, but when it comes to dealing with government policy, this is some of the statistics that's going to have to waken up our politicians to make them understand this is a costly issue, not just for lives, but economically. Because every year, the global economy loses $1 trillion for a lack of treatment to mental health issues. And if there's not an economic cost, like I said, the humane cost is much worse. Because every year, we're seeing 1 million suicides annually as a result of lacking treatment to those who are depressed, anxious, schizophrenic, etc. Then, of course, as I mentioned, there's more stigma and distrust, and this poses another very interesting psychological study by Goldberg and Morrison that predated Box called social drift hypothesis that said the opposite of the first one. That was actually, if you have a worse economic situation, it actually worsens your mental health. So if you look at social drift and social causation, we are seeing a vicious cycle that people who are poor are more likely to become mentally ill, and those who are mentally ill are more likely to become poor. This is solely because of a lacking treatment and the stigmas that are impacting these mentally ill people and those who have mental disorders from seeking the treatment necessary, whether it be an issue of accessibility or them willing to go up and get treatment. And of course, the United Nations, as I mentioned earlier, says the leading cause of disability. Yes.
You are at, you might wrap it up. You are at 22 minutes.
Okay. I'll quickly go through this then. To the last slide. So really, that's all I really need to mention for that. But when we look to the future, because in the spirit of the movement, it's not really it's not difficult to start, but it requires everyone coming together for a movement to be effective. So it really includes talking to those around you. More specifically, like I mentioned earlier, talking to youth because they're the most vulnerable demographic, and then social activism. There's a few movements people can do volunteer service for and even work for, such as MGMH, Movement for Global Mental Health. The WHO has 2 separate organizations, MIND, which is about development of mental health policies and MHGAP, which is about filling the gap between developed countries and developing countries and improving mental health policy. So these are a few organizations. You can just go to their websites and see that matters. And the very last thing I just want to touch on before I end my presentation is that for those who are suffering from these issues, the most important thing is seeking out help when the help is there. Because it requires not only people who are not facing mental illnesses, but those who are also facing these mental illnesses to come together and seek the proper treatment. Because if we can't treat ourselves and with the resources we have now, it's going to be more difficult in the future for us to make mental health advocacy a more prominent movement around the world, in the UK, in the US, and any country. So here's just a list of a few crisis hotlines people could call if they feel like it's necessary. So that's all I have to say about global mental health.
Thank you very much, Robert. We now move to our final presentation from Ryan McAteer, NYU London. Alternative for Europe, countering right-wing movements.
So for starters, I want to start off with Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland party. This recent election, they received 13.3% of the national vote. And I know initially 13.3% does not sound like a lot, but I would ask you, would you want your grade to be lowered by 13.3%, your salary to be lowered by 13.3%? These numbers can actually really matter, especially when it comes to national elections. Alternative for Deutschland are currently the third biggest party in the Bundestag, which is the German parliament. Now, their ideology, they have some right-wing staples, and they also have some new ones. So, first, German nationalism, that's to be expected. Climate change skepticism, again, to be expected. Restriction on LGBTQ and women's rights. Divided on free trade, so at least they're not completely protectionist. And anti-immigration, primarily against Muslims as a result of the Syrian refugee crisis. Under their anti-immigration policies they wish to enact, they want to ban burqas, the full face veils, foreign funding of mosques, and the ban on the Muslim call to prayer, out of fear of Islamisierung, or Islamization of Germany. Now, I know it sounds bad, but unfortunately it gets a bit worse. There's also the Junge Alternative Party, which is Young Alternative, or as I'm going to call them now, Ja. So they were founded in 2013, and they're supposed to be the baseline for young people to join Alternative for Deutschland. Now, I don't know if it's just because I'm in a really old building right now, but I'm hearing a lot of echoes of the past. AfD's nationalism is very similar to the Nazi nationalism. Anti-LGBTQ women and women's rights is very similar to Nazi persecution in ideology, not practice. Anti-Islam is very similar to the anti-Semitic sentiments held by the Nazi party. And Ja are very similar to the Hitler Youth. And the rhetoric is actually exactly the same, as several politicians for Alternative for Deutschland have been found using Nazi terms such as Lügenpresse, which is lying press, or we would most accurately translate that now in our modern language to fake news. And Völkisch, originally it's from the German word for people, Volk, but it was used to describe people of Germanic origin back in the Nazi regime. It's better. France, the Front National, the National Front. They had 13.02% of the vote back in 2017. Thankfully, Marine Le Pen lost to Emmanuel Macron, 66.1% to her 33.9%. Their ideology is quite similar but different in its own ways. Their first point is law and order. What does this mean exactly? Zero tolerance for crime, increasing punishment harshness, increasing prison sentences to even longer, having more prisons, and even a referendum for reinstating the death penalty. There's also fierce anti-Muslim immigration policies that they want to enact, very similar to Alternative for Deutschland. I remember reading a poster, and the English translation for the poster said, the immigrants are going to vote, and you're abstaining. They also associate Islam with terror, especially after the recent attacks on France, and mainly Paris. And then they're also fiercely anti-EU and nationalist, so that's one thing that they all have in common. Okay, Austria. The Freiheitliche Partei Österreichs, or the Freedom Party of Austria, or the FPÖ, led by Sebastian Kurz, who is only 31 years old. I would think that the stereotype for a right-wing leader would be someone in their 50s, 60s. He's only twice my age. His party won a plurality in the 2017 election, and soon after he was made Chancellor of Austria. His ideology is actually very different from the other two I found. They believe in individual freedom and the welfare state. They've been known for their contradictions in their party policy and platform. They also are very anti-immigration and anti-Islam, naturally. And then Heimat, translated into English as homeland, or it's actually used as a synonym for cultural identity. Originally, their party platform was pan-Germanistic, meaning combining all German-speaking nations, but they've rapidly shifted to Austrian nationalism recently. Now, unfortunately, I could go on. Alternative for Sverige, Alternative for Sweden, the Danish People's Party, the Slavic National Party, the Lithuanian Order and Justice Party, the Bulgarian National Movement, and the Dutch Party for Freedom all exist too, almost creating an axis of evil in modern day. But before I rail against them, I would like to try walking in their shoes briefly. There was an EU law set in place, the Dublin Regulation of 1993, and then the second one in 2003, as the older one in 1993 was not agreed on by all European Union nations. This states that once a refugee lands in a European nation, they are to settle in that European nation and not to shift them over or use them as political gain in any way. This was repealed during the 2015 Syrian refugee crisis, so the anger there is completely natural, as why would you have a law set in place if you're only going to repeal it when it's actually needed? This law also did severely punish Italy, Austria, Hungary, those countries, as they are closer to the points of conflict, and Turkey in this case, which all of them agree that if Turkey joins the EU, they're going to leave the EU. And there's also cultural and language barriers. Most people in Germany, I would say, don't know Arabic. Most Syrian refugees do not know German. Very different cultures, very different languages. So I would say their anger is natural, but misguided. Now, the similarities between all of them, nationalism, anti-Islam, Eurosceptic, protectionist, anti-immigration, all link them together into this axis of evil, but however, I see this problem as not a blanket group attacking right-wing parties, as each one has individual cultural identities that they use in their platforms, such as Heimat is very different than the Alternative for Deutschland's policies, different from the National Front. So, I've concluded that grassroots resistance is the way to go. University students in '68 are the best example. As Emily mentioned earlier, 500 NYU students protested against Dow Chemical, the creator of napalm. University of Warsaw, 300 students protested on January 30th, 1968 against an authoritarian regime. Unfortunately, it was quelled. University of Bonn students actually got their president to resign as he was accused and found guilty of helping to build concentration camps during the Second World War. And lastly, one I found very interesting was Stockholm University protested against apartheid countries, mainly South Africa, during a tennis match. All of these students held sit-ins and were even helped out by a lot of the staff members of their respective universities, helping their causes to be pushed into place. Nonviolence is a very key aspect of these protests that needs to be held up in the highest regard. Without nonviolence, you would just stoop down to their level. You cannot allow that. So nonviolent protests, being active in voting, and even boycotting are all helpful tools to use, especially when they're rising so rapidly in the past 3 years. Grassroots organizations, such as Martin Luther King Jr.'s civil rights movement, have to be the way to do this. As each country is so individual and unique in their culture, we need to address those cultures in order to achieve the goals of stopping the movement. So whether you be a student, a worker, a teacher, even a politician, it's important to use your rights to vote, to protest peacefully, and to speak freely. Now, before I end, I would like to quote one of my favorite authors, Hannah Arendt, from The Origins of Totalitarianism. People have been found to resist the most powerful monarchs and to refuse to bow down before them, but few indeed have been found to resist the crowd, to stand up alone before misguided masses, to face their implacable frenzy without weapons and with folded arms, to dare no when a yes is demanded. Instead of using the reservoir of fear-mongering and hate that right-wing parties are using, it's important to channel the reservoir of liberation, freedom, and action that was present in 1968. Thank you.
Okay, we're now going to initiate our final roundtable. I just want to make sure everyone's here. Good, good. Raj, you might want to scoot over so you can be seen. Yeah,
Sure.
great. You know, being the faculty moderator, I first have to say how both impressed and intrigued I am by the presentations. And I want to put something before the panels and participants that you might comment on, and then turn to your own questions to each other. So we have two presentations that specifically articulate a vision of politics and the world that run counter to the sort of dominant interests in the social movements of 1968. And in particular, I'm thinking of the religious right that Raj spoke about, but also the alt-right that Ryan talked about. And I'm just curious as to how we might think about those two particular groups as movements that not only run counter to the spirit of the 68 sort of emancipatory movements, which are looking to expand moral and political vision to include people who've been marginalized and full participation and freedom in society. And in particular, we also had with respect to, in particular, the two presentations we had which deal with mental health and health issues generally, euthanasia and mental illness. And what I'm finding interesting is maybe our panelists could comment in our first entry into dialogue here on how you envision how the alt-right, as Ryan was detailing it, and the religious right would respond to the sort of advocacy claims that Robert and Rachel were articulating in terms of public health issues. That is to say, maybe you could talk a bit about what you know about how those two right movements sort of view the claims of the public health issues that were brought up by our panelists. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
So how about it?
So I guess in terms of like mental health care advocacy for global mental health care, so a lot of the far right movements, because of a transfer of like funding, obviously to more heightened border security, more military spending, like the Trump administration has increased military spending, and obviously it has to come from somewhere. So especially with all the oppositions like Obamacare, healthcare in general, whether it be for physical or mental, I can tell you that the far right is definitely a lot more draining than just typical Republicans who've had opposition to the healthcare movements. And I think it's even worse when we talk about Ryan's presentation, like in Europe and the countries that are like having the most refugees, because refugees are the most susceptible to mental disorders. And I mean, the far right first has to let them through the door, and then imagine asking for mental health care treatment, it won't fly because of far right policies.
Because their argument is that they do believe in welfare, but welfare for citizens of their native countries. So that's the rhetoric used, is that we can't have welfare for refugees and citizens, we just can't afford it. So targeting the people that aren't citizens is just the easy out.
And that usually resonates with like why developing countries has a more lacking treatment than developed.
I would say for physician-assisted death, it's really similar, as the alt-right and the religious right kind of fall under the same category here. As I talked about, there are some very strong opponents to the law and to advocating patient rights and kind of the complete control of a person over their own body, which traditionally the religious right don't advocate for. So in this case, I think it's similar to what you said. They're in the same box, and they aren't typically open to dialogue just because it's separate from what the Bible says and a lot of religious influences. Actually, in preparation for writing a story for the New York Compassion and Choices campaign, I interviewed some Orthodox religious rabbis from Passaic, New Jersey, and they said that they would actually be in favor of passing the right to die law because the Jewish perspective is to not interfere with anyone else's life. They wouldn't necessarily use the law themselves, likely not use the law themselves, but the perspective in their community is not to interfere with other people's lives and to have everyone make their own choice. I was really surprised at that moment because it's gone against everything I just said. But I think that there are points in which we can be surprised, and we see people who are whose empathy can overcome their religious kind of fundamentalism or loyalty can come out to benefit the right to die.
The interesting thing about that is, given that there are evangelicals on both the progressive and conservative ends of the spectrum, they will both, of course, use their individual or personal interpretations of their religious beliefs or core values to reflect on, their policy beliefs. With the evangelical conservatives in the U.S., yes, I believe it's a reactionary method that mainly drives their opposition to these progressive movements, but it is definitely their religious values that inform their agenda, even though it might not be at the root motivator. So when euthanasia, I feel, and mental illness, you can both sort of place under that category of choice and life. And oftentimes when you boil it down to these key words or these trigger words, the religious right and alt-right will already know which side they need to take.
And that's why I was mentioning, like, from my personal background, coming from like the Bible Belt area of the United States, there is that stigma which not only prevents the treatment but worsens the illnesses, because the same thing Raj is talking about. There's this ingrained tradition of, alternate ways of dealing with it, such as, praying away. But that's just what's on the front. Behind the scenes, these like conservative families will be paying for politicians who have advocacy, who are possibly also alt-right, who will not fund healthcare propositions that help mental health care, for example.
Yeah. Emily, looking at all of the strands of causes, from feminism to Black Power, to other sorts of foci or centers of movement of 68, I wonder if you had any sort of contact with advocacy along the lines of mental health. There was a literature at that time that was beginning a very strong critique of mental health institutions in particular, but I just wonder if in your research, that stream of articulating what emancipation would mean or what a future democratic society would mean came up at all in your own research on 68 and activism.
Yeah, I don't think it necessarily came up in a tangible way, but something I've been thinking a lot about is like issues like mental health or environmentalism or kind of the broader issues you were talking about. I think what's interesting is issues that I think what I found most interesting is issues that hadn't been polarized yet, starting from the 60s and moving kind of forward until now, become polarized. So like, I'm not sure that mental health issues had necessarily taken up, I don't think either of the parties necessarily were advocating yet, maybe. And then maybe after the 60s and kind of into now, I think politicians take up issues that hadn't necessarily been claimed by a side. So for instance, with environmentalism, it hadn't been claimed by either party. It was like I feel that most issues are, they affect kind of everyone regardless of party loyalty. But I think I didn't necessarily, my research didn't touch down on mental health specifically, but I think with regards to the broader movements, I think that it's interesting how kind of on the timeline of these activist movements, how we're reacting to how kind of issues that hadn't necessarily been polarized before were claimed by a party and then the narratives changed. So, but yeah, none of the movements that I was looking at were health related even. I was looking at like civil rights, and then the movements on campus were kind of really, really specific as far as like representation. So like for Howard or in the universities in France. But
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting feature of the inherited sort of texts and story we have of 68, that while there was not perhaps the most significant amount of discussion about mental health as a part of what would need to change in order for us to really get beyond some of the social pathology that 68ers were articulating. It was there in a smaller way, but now it seems as though it's become a candidate for a more mainstream question as to what we should mobilize for with respect to the moral goals, you might say, of 68. Ryan, you know, in covering the alt-right and doing some of the research you've done on fascism, I wonder if you've come across any in your study, or you could maybe speak to or envision what a kind of right-wing, alt-right, and even fascist sort of approach to an issue like mental health might look like. I mean, can you, if you haven't come across anything in particular, can you elaborate what you take to be that vision with respect to an issue like mental health, or take, for instance, euthanasia, or take Raj's stepping stone for the religious right movement, around which they, you know, coalesced the issue of abortion, which many people think, while it is an issue of political rights and gender rights, they also think of it as a healthcare right.
So in regards to fascist regimes in history, it's been shown that they would definitely be supportive of euthanization of people, as the belief in the strong need to be strong and the weak need to be weak. They would obviously, if someone is in such a state where they're obviously going to die, they would just say, pull the cord, it's over for them. In regards to mental health, a similar stance would be taken, where there would be a lack of compassion, as they would be seen as inferior human beings. Take Nazi Germany or fascist Italy are the prime examples, where some people were just believed to be inferior just at birth. In regards to the alt-right, it's a bit hard to say, because in their ideology it's very family focused, very the stereotypical German town, French town, Italian town, whatever it is. And having, you know, 2 kids, a mother and a father, it would be counterintuitive for them to lack compassion if they really did believe in family values, and especially since Austria wants welfare, they love welfare, but they blame the lack of it, or the lack of funding on it, on refugees. It just seems that it would be very counterintuitive for them not to support mental health care, although I would not put it past them, especially since historical examples have shown us that people can really lack compassion.
Yeah, I have plenty of questions, you know, such interesting presentations. I wonder if you had questions for each other, or things that the other presentations brought to mind for you that you'd like to comment on.
I actually had a question for Ryan, as far as, you know, the origins of these alt-right movements in these European countries. So when we're looking at evangelical conservatives and the religious right in America, that feeling of marginalization, sort of that fear, plays into, or that psyche plays into, you know, motivation for their political agenda. Do the alt-right movements in European countries feel any, you know, that same sort of victimization, or what do you think their main?
They're terrified. They see a lot of refugees coming to their country that don't look like them, that don't have the same religion as them, don't even speak their language or understand cultural norms. That the Islamization of France, of Germany, of Austria is the biggest fear. So in order to counteract this fear, acting emotionally instead of logically, they form these parties staunch nationalist, don't want any other help. They want to be just Germany, just France, not EU. They're absolutely terrified. And I can see the fear, I can see the anxiety and being nervous for difference. However, a proper way of approaching the issue would be to have teachers teach German, teach French, teach Italian, whatever it is. Teach, oh, this is Italian culture, we celebrate this day, this day, this day for this reason, that reason, that reason, because we are Protestant, we are Catholic, whatever it is. And it's a complicated issue because being able to empathize with people being scared, especially in the US, you can see it all the time. That's why Donald Trump got elected. But it's not rational, so it's hard to help in a way that doesn't seem aggressive.
Do you think that the alt-right groups in any of these countries would be open to hiring teachers to teach their culture and kind of help to integrate immigrants?
Well, so a lot of actions have been made in more progressive countries, Scandinavia, for example, but right now the fear and the hatred is so deep that it would be difficult to convince it as a compromise instead of, it's either you hate Muslims or you like Muslims, and if you like Muslims, you're not one of us, so we're not gonna like you, basically. So it's just a very polarizing issue, not very open to compromise.
To stem from her question, so let's say there was, let's say these countries who maybe want to have a guise of educating and helping, like refugees, for example, do you think it'd be worse for them to have an education that's tailored to like let them know like they're like inferior, for example? Because if you look at Barcelona, for example, and the Catalonia independence, one of the biggest issues they're having there is that Spanish education policy is forcing the Catalan language out of Catalan schools in Barcelona. So do you think there's education that could also be a harm to it?
Oh yeah, of course.
I think we also need to think about it in terms of equality and equity. Brendan, you said that they think that it's a healthcare right in terms of how these liberal groups attack, like how liberal groups and 68 activists kind of attack issues and present policy. But I was thinking, what's the difference between a healthcare right and a human right? Like, how can we define what is a citizen in relation to their body, and how people who are new immigrants into places, what kind of pull do we have on them? And if they, in theory, they would choose what place they immigrate into, and they would know kind of what the politics are like. But we know that that's not the case, so we can't really cleanly say this is separate. Like, if you're a citizen, you have this set of rights. If you have a body and you want to have control over your body, this is your set of rights. We have to kind of navigate this playing field of, and same with mental health. We don't really know how to, where mental health necessarily falls. Is it a civic issue? It is a healthcare issue, and everyone is vulnerable to it, as everyone has a head and a brain. But
it's also a social issue more than just health too.
Exactly.
A lot of it's based on interaction.
And is that, yeah, there's too many different quadrants to put this right into. So we don't know exactly how to attack it because we don't have a direct source of the problem.
Do you think making mental health care a social issue would help to progress mental health care if everyone sees it as, oh, instead of this individual having this illness, why should I help them? If you make it about everyone, do you think it would be more inclusive and therefore have more?
I would say it depends on how a country and its just like constituents prioritize issues. So right now, the biggest issue for the United States typically is either national defense or the economy. So if we would say that we're losing $1 trillion every year because of lack of treatment, now it's an economic issue. And that's going to be important for trying to convince policy makers to put it on the forefront. But if it becomes a healthcare issue, it's become that's a very bipartisan issue. Everyone wants to fix the economy, but healthcare, it's split. And then a social issue, the reason why you may want to categorize it that way is because like 68, when there is a social movement, you get more energy going. Like if you look on March on Our Lives, that's already re-energized the gun debate because there's more social activism. So I think it's partly educating policymakers and partly making sure the people are expressing their views, which I think you can put mental health care then is predominantly a social movement.
But also, how do we define progress in terms of that? Is it just, because a lot of being sick is living with your sickness and kind of getting up in the morning and doing your day-to-day activities. So to progress mental health care and healthcare in general would be, I think, to be more in terms of having everyone be aware of a situation of someone who's depressed or someone who's anorexic and say, I know how to cater to that on a kind of community level, as opposed to let's solve all the problems. Here's buy this new drug, stop thinking you're fat, something like that.
Part of the difficulty in measuring progress is the variables used to assess it. I know right now happiness is quite big, and in the DSM it states that in order for you to have a mental health disorder, it's in the name, it has to be causing you some sort of angst in your life. So I think one variable that could be used would be happiness. How you obtain that happiness and how it's been obtained, it's a good question, but choosing specific variables for specific issues is the way to assess the nature and the progression.
To ask our colleague at NYU Florence, since you talked a lot about like the history of the '68 movement, do you think we'd see the same energy for the movements like civil rights issues that we would see now? Do you think if we were like say put mental health care and euthanasia, those issues as the foreground issues back in '68, do you think it would be as successful?
I don't know. I think that it's a question of legitimacy, and so like in the moment, I think the issues that kind of gain traction are kind of organized around issues that people are agreeing on are legitimate. And so should, I don't know, a huge population of people in '68 decide that mental health is something that they want to organize around and see policy change about, I think it's hard to compare mental health to civil rights, because I think that I think policy implications around the civil rights were very clear cut, and like the progress that the organizers wanted was very easy to kind of delineate and very easy to kind of put into words and very easy to write into demands. Whereas I think that mental health is I'm not sure if it just would have had to be socially relevant and kind of socially relevant to enough people's lives and enough people's like daily experience to be something that could have gained such national traction. I mean, I don't know if I can speak for the entire time. I think it very well could have. I think the energy in the US and Europe was kind of lent itself to young people who I think are really implicated by mental health issues. So I think, sure, they could have. I don't know. I think it's just really, it's hard for me to say, because I don't know that I have enough information to make a well-informed statement about how policy could change the way that mental health is treated in this country. But if you're asking if it's a question of whether I think that issue could have been picked up, I think definitely. I think that it wasn't just civil rights in '68. I think there were smaller on-campus issues. You look at Berkeley in '64, and all kids wanted to do was be able to pamphlet on campus. So I think that '68 was the first time that students and people our age realized that we could make societal change. And I think a lot of individuals felt like they could make that societal change. So I think, sure, they could have.
Sorry, if I just could, I noticed, and this is an issue with your moderator. On my screen, I'm not seeing Rachel. If she could swing around a bit. Yeah. So I don't know if you're seeing, her, much better. Of course, Emily, it's always very difficult to be asked what historians call a counterfactual question. Could it have been the case that, or could it be the case that? But it's very interesting to bring up mental health because there are issues with respect to how do we classify mental illness, and what are the sources of it? Are they social or genetic, some mixture of both? There has been a huge movement on behalf of the differently able to reconceptualize what ability means and these types of things. And then how do we conceive of mental illness as a brain thing or a social thing or some other type of causal sort of explanation for mental illness, that does still seem to put it in a sort of foggy, vague sort of area, whereas some of the other issues, take for instance sexism or racism, seem, at least so far in terms of our sort of conceptual resources with respect to mental health, to be more defined. Now, of course, there's a discourse that has gone on to break down some of those definitions, make it much less easy. And so it's not some sort of monolithic or easy to focus on topic, race or sex or class. I'm interested, if I could, in bringing up 68 in the youth. Emily, you focused on some of the political participation issues with respect to representative democracy and elections as one of the main sort of focus for activism today, getting youth involved. I wonder what the panelists think about where your generation stands with respect to the energies required or how they think of social movements in terms of mobilizing, in terms of engaging in the intensity and duration and level of some of the movements of 68, because those movements, of course, were highly conflictual and resulted in the Kent State example as the most stark, 4 students being shot by the National Guard, right? Because of another issue that has not come up. Well, it did come up, but just in terms of mobilization, the Vietnam War. So I think we could go around and just have a concluding word from each of the panelists on where we are now with respect to the agents, the youth of today, as compared to the sort of youth-generated movement of 68. Right? And we can go in any order.
I'd like to start, if that's okay. Emily mentioned how TVs and the popularization of kind of the media and knowing more about each individual's story helped to progress the movements of 68. I once read it as TVs as the democratizer of ideas, which I quite liked. And I think that this led to kind of circulation of stories and attention to more niche issues so that people could hear other people's perspectives and understandings of mental health and feelings about assisted death. So I think that kind of a focus on the media can help progress us to where we are and saying, and especially as NYU students, we're taught all the time, this is what, we don't totally know what the facts are, but this is kind of what a more conservative view is, this is what a more liberal view is, but make sure that you're informed on all edges of an issue in order to kind of gain traction in it. And I think that that's something to take into account as we move forward as students, is that we will never truly know what an issue is. We only know how we feel and how others feel in relation to it. And that's kind of a jumping off point for us to make positive change, I think, in our communities.
Well, I see our generation as more all bark and no bite. I think that with the rise of social media, it's very easy to tweet something but then forget about it and not necessarily act on it. I think there could be some perhaps public holidays for election day put in place to make sure that not only can younger people vote, but also people who have work on a certain time where it would be a time crunch to get to voting. That could actually help action. I see the act of voting as really the most powerful way of protest against an idea you don't like, or a most powerful way of support, not just a tweet or a Facebook post.
Yeah, I'd like to speak to that. I like the phrasing "all bark, no bite." I think a lot of the stats and a lot of the research I was looking into absolutely confirms that. With regard to where we were in '68 as opposed to where we are now, a lot of the statistics I was reading argue that we're in the same place politically as far as students being civically engaged on campuses and concerned with political issues. Colin Barker writes that the movements didn't end after 1968. In fact, student movements were normalized, and maybe that's why '68 seems so revolutionary, because this was the first time that student movements and young people mobilizing was normal. Whereas now it's happening on all college, well, I don't know if I can say all, but a lot of college campuses. But I think as far as enacting real change, I think absolutely the best way is to vote. And we see such a discrepancy in how many people are, or how many young people are interested in political issues, interested in on-campus issues, but aren't voting. So I think maybe closing that gap is the best takeaway, the best thing to consider doing.
Okay, if I could, well spoken. You know, voting is, of course, in the United States context, where most of you will be next year, if not all of you, a sort of vote for a candidate, but also the party structure is such that the parties have a ton of power. And I wonder if you have a sense, any of you, that people in your cohort are interested in party politics as opposed to mere campaigns they pick and choose that they like, that fit their beliefs. I mean, just personal question to the panelists, are parties important to you? Do you work with the party?
I would say, are we limiting this to political parties or just organizations in general?
Well, when we talk about voting, we're talking about candidates who are selected and promoted and organized in order to win elections by party people, right? The Democratic National Committee, the Republican National Committee. It is a huge sort of apparatus for organizing who you even get to look at, right? When you look at your ballot, right? Now, of course, there are movements to get people who, for instance, Bernie Sanders is not a member of the Democratic Party, right? But he had made those inroads he did due to his own sort of movement, or what he called a political revolution. So I'm just curious what your feelings are about parties, because when we emphasize elections and the power of people in your cohort to vote, whether or not you make that link, right? And then I'll be quiet because this is your time.
For assisted death, oftentimes what the organizations do is they scout out candidates, political candidates that are kind of on the way up. They haven't totally established their opinion on every single issue, and we kind of hoped for them to endorse. So we bring some activists, some people who have some stories to tell about their experience with assisted death or a painful death that could have benefited from physician-assisted death, and we kind of have them hear the story of these people in the community that advocate for the right, and hope that in hopes that they endorse them. And actually, there has been a mostly liberal, but Democratic, but significantly Republican approval of the assisted death issue across the U.S. And I think that shows that this issue specifically, because issues of aging are applicable to both parties and every other party in between, people on both sides can become advocates, and it doesn't kind of have a particular leaning one way or the other. That being said, it doesn't have a religious leaning. It doesn't advocate to people who, sorry, one more time, it doesn't cater to people who have a religious inclination. So unfortunately, it excludes people in those communities as long as they're kind of steadfastly committed to exactly what the word says in the Bible or in their faith.
I would say political parties are important to me, not in the sense that they're necessary for our representative democracy to function, but when we're looking at it in the context of progressive movements versus movements that stand opposed, parties don't help in the sense of unification. At the end of the day, factions are exactly that. They're factions. Their ability to organize behind issues should be looked at as far as studying and adopting strategy to mobilize from a grassroots level. But when we're looking at the issue of implementing policy, it doesn't help when the policies you're looking at are being divided between one side or another side. So referring specifically to the two-party system, it stands in the way of unification, of building that common ground that does exist between, let's say, conservative evangelicals and progressives.
I agree with Raj. I would say that if someone asks you, oh, are you a Democrat or a Republican, you have to choose one. Whereas you might agree with the Democrats on some issues, with the Republicans on some others. Issues are being looked at as the lens of party politics instead of what's the best for people. And so if the Democratic platform or the Republican platform is as it's stated, you cannot be a good Democrat or a good Republican if you don't completely blanketly agree with every single issue and stance on the issue that they take.
And I'd say for these parties, they do try to, all of their platforms across economic, social, political issues are their idea of what the best way of life is. But I think that this party system, especially in relation to the United States, makes a very clear-cut dichotomy that cannot be broken, where you, like Ryan was saying, you have to pick one or the other and blanket it down, when really probably the best ways of life may require a more centrist approach, like more ideas from the right and the left. But centrists are always forced to pick one side or another, and at the end of the day, people who have a third, fourth, fifth different political idea are just left behind.
I mean, one of the reason why I bring up the question is getting a sense of the issue for students with respect to how parties operate, given the structure of representative government. In this case, we're speaking of the US. When you have committees, which in the Congress are responsible for taking up bills and discussing bills, the committees and the power in those committees depends upon the majority party, right, in Congress, right? And this is one of the arguments for party activity, even on the parts of individuals such as yourself who are articulating intelligently some of the ways in which the dichotomy of a two-party system sort of prevents cooperation and increases polarization. But the idea is, for instance, that, you've got parties, and parties control legislation. And even if you may not agree with the candidate in your location for which you have the power of a vote to send to Congress, you know that in order for your party's more global vision, you need more of your party members in the Congress to get all the other things that you care about and that you consider to be of common concern for all Americans into the seats of power that control those committees and get legislation passed. I mean, it's just to bring into the conversation with respect to all of the issues you're bringing up and the types of energies that social movements create and the type of progress towards which they move a nation into the sort of mechanics and nitty-gritty of the articulation of something like a party. And this is all stemming from your own insights into the power of voting. Are there any final comments from our panelists?
I would say it's just important to kind of never give up on our issues. We're a lot of bark, but we can be bite too. We just look fairly old enough, so we need to kind of collect ourselves as a group and figure out what issues kind of have a historical backing for us to support, to latch onto those, and to see what other new issues are created with all of our data scandals and our technological issues, and see how we can access them and just kind of keep working for the mission and make sure that we can accomplish it together without being well-researched, well-informed, and lastly, without kind of having bias when we approach new territory.
I was gonna say, I just want, I guess, thank everyone here, because obviously there was no like debating, yelling at one another. So I think that the core tenet for any movement should really be educating, not attacking. Otherwise, we'll never win the fight if you're not trying to be cooperative. So I think it's good to have dialogues like these and express issues people may not be informed about.
Okay, well, wonderful. I want to thank our panelists again for an excellent conversation and dialogue, which will continue online on the LaPietra Dialogues website, which will have a blog with respect to these issues. I would like to once more thank the director of NYU London, Catherine Robson, the director of NYU Florence, Ellen Toscano, and Dean Julie Mostov in Liberal Studies in New York for supporting these crucial conversations. And once again, thanks to our panelists, and we look forward to the next LaPietra Dialogue, Global Student Dialogue.